You know, it's one of the biggest, most enduring questions in all of history. Why do great powers rise, and why do they always, inevitably, seem to fall? Is there some kind of hidden pattern to it all, a predictable cycle that drives the fate of empires?
I mean, for literally centuries, people have stood in the ruins of past civilizations and wondered if the exact same fate was waiting for their own. What are the forces at play that cause even the most powerful nations to eventually just crumble? Well, one man, a British soldier and historian named Sir John Glubb, was convinced he'd found the answer. Back in 1978, he wrote this incredible essay called The Fate of Empires, and in it, he laid out a really bold theory. That for the last 3,000 years, great powers have all followed a surprisingly predictable life cycle.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to explore Glubb's cycle. We'll start with the big, overarching pattern he noticed. Then we're going to dive into his 6 distinct ages from that explosive rise of pioneers all the way to the final age of decadence. And we'll ask, what can this teach us today?
Okay, so what exactly was this fundamental pattern that Glubb saw? What did he notice that so many others seem to have missed?
Well, get this. After studying 11 different empires across history, Glubb came to a pretty startling conclusion. The average lifespan of a great power, from its fiery birth to its final decline, is almost always around 250 years. That's about 10 human generations.
And here's the really wild part. Technology seemed to make zero difference to this pattern. You had the Assyrians, right? They fought with spears and marched on foot. Then you have the British Empire, with machine guns, railways, the whole 9 yards. Despite these massive technological gaps, their empires lasted for roughly the same amount of time. To Glubb, this was a huge clue. It suggested that the real forces driving history aren't technological, they're human and psychological.
So all this led him to a central framework, this predictable 6-stage path that he argued every single empire seems to follow, from birth to death. So let's unpack each one.
All right, so how does it all begin? What's the spark that ignites the fire of a brand new empire?
Well, it all starts with what Glubb called the Age of Pioneers. He also called it the outburst. This is that moment when a small, often totally overlooked group of people just suddenly explodes onto the world stage.
This phase is just defined by this raw, unrestrained energy. These rising powers are usually poor, they're tough, they're incredibly aggressive. And they're not bound by old traditions, so they're brilliant improvisers. If one thing doesn't work, they just try something else. I mean, think about Macedon under Philip and Alexander. They went from being a nobody state to an empire stretching all the way to India in just 36 years. That's the power of the outburst.
Okay, so after that initial explosion of energy, things begin to consolidate. That young, scrappy power starts to mature into a much more organized and an increasingly commercial empire. This brings us to the next 2 stages, the ages of conquest and commerce. That original pioneer spirit of just making things up as you go along, that gives way to organized, professional military campaigns. And as these vast new territories are secured, the very soul of the empire starts to change. And here, you see this fundamental shift in what people value. In the Age of Conquests, the highest virtues are things like glory, honor, service to the nation. But as the Age of Commerce takes over, this new mercantile culture emerges, and, as Glubb so perfectly puts it, to a merchant, ideas of honor are just empty words which add nothing to the bank balance. The pursuit of wealth starts to replace the pursuit of glory. So this new focus on wealth leads to what looks like the empire's absolute peak. It's the golden age. But for Glubb, this was actually the beginning of the end.
So let's talk about the ages of affluence and intellect. At this point, the pursuit of money becomes pretty much the only goal, and that old military spirit starts to just fade away. And then it's followed by this surprising pivot, from just accumulating wealth to now pursuing intellectual and academic honors.
You can really see the empire starting to turn inward. During this age of affluence, duty is replaced by the hunt for cash. Defense is no longer about fighting your enemies, it's about paying them off with subsidies. Military service even gets looked down on as something primitive. And then, in the age of intellect, the focus shifts again. Now the highest ambition becomes academic prestige, and you see these vast fortunes just poured into universities.
And that, of course, brings us to the final, terminal stage in Glubb's cycle, the unraveling. And the fatal threat at this point is no longer coming from outside enemies, but from within.
In this final age of decadence, everything we've talked about so far culminates. The very virtues that built the empire, things like duty, courage, a sense of unity, they're all replaced by their opposites. And that leads to a slow, but pretty certain decline.
Glubb identified several key symptoms of this final phase. Society just gets consumed by internal political squabbles and endless arguments. A defensive mindset replaces that old aggression, and you see widespread materialism, a weakening of traditional religion, and the growth of a welfare state, all signaling that the end is probably near.
Now, to be really clear about one of his more controversial points, Glubb also argued that a large influx of foreigners contributes to this decline because it disrupts the empire's unity. He wrote that while homogeneous cultures tend to have this natural solidarity, newcomers can form their own separate communities and might be less willing to sacrifice for a nation that, once conquered their ancestors.
So after laying out this entire pretty bleak 250-year cycle, what was Glubb's ultimate point? I mean, why does studying this recurring pattern even matter?
His ultimate plea was really for perspective. He argued that instead of being so fixated on our own nation's relatively brief history, we should zoom out and study the entire 4,000-year story of humanity. By just calmly observing this grand, repeating pattern of rise and fall, he really believed we might find the lessons we need to solve our own problems.
Which of course leaves us with the most provocative question of all. It's the one his theory just forces us to ask. If this 250-year pattern is real, then which of these 6 stages are we in right now?